Welcome, friend. Close your eyes and imagine another time, being a Japanese soldier at the end of World War II. A conflict that shaped nations, families, and futures. In this gentle retelling, we'll explore the events and voices of that era softly, steadily, so you can relax as history tells its story. Let's begin. The air didn't feel like air anymore. It felt like something heavier, thick with the smell of damp wood, rusted metal, and sweat that clung to the back of your throat. A soldier doesn't usually notice these things. They become background noise, like the buzz of mosquitoes or the scrape of boots. But when everything else has slowed, when the chaos dips and the only sound is your own breath, you feel them more sharply. For this soldier, crouched near the perimeter of a makeshift camp, the stillness was more unnerving than battle. Silence meant you could hear things you didn't want to, the tick of fear in your chest, the soft crackle of a distant fire that might be theirs or ours, the occasional cough of a comrade whose face you no longer dared to study too long. He adjusted his rifle, though he wasn't sure why. It felt like the one thing he could control when nothing else made sense. And then, somewhere beyond the tree line, a bird called. Just one, and strangely clear. It was the kind of sound that, months earlier, might have meant nothing, but now it carried a weight. Was it signaling danger? Or just living oblivious to the madness of men? His fingers tightened around the weapon, calloused, dirt-worn, but shaking. He thought of home, not because he wanted to, but because moments of quiet were the enemy of discipline. A mother's voice. A sister's laughter. A house that might not exist anymore. The war had taken those thoughts and twisted them, but they came back anyway. And each memory carried a sting. What if they were gone? What if he was the last one left to remember? The sound of boots nearby pulled him back. A whisper too low to catch, but enough to feel the tension coil again. Orders would come soon. They always did. Sometimes shouted, sometimes scribbled, sometimes nothing but a gesture. You moved because moving was survival. You didn't ask why. You didn't even want to know. He shifted, feeling the strap of his pack bite into his shoulder, the weight of metal digging into bone. And though the jungle was alive, everything in him felt still, waiting. The jungle didn't hum anymore. It pressed in, close and heavy, like a damp blanket you couldn't push off. Everything about it seemed thicker, the air, the smell, even the light, which filtered through leaves like half-forgotten promises. You'd think a man would get used to it, but he hadn't. Every morning, waking up to that wet heat and that clinging sense of being watched, his chest tightened. It wasn't fear exactly, not the kind you'd admit, but something more ancient, like an instinct that kept your muscles taut even when you were still. It started with the smells. Sweat was one thing, but when it mixed with mildew, oil, the faint tang of gunmetal, and the sour-sweet rot of old food, it became something else. He remembered his first months here when the odors turned his stomach. Now they just slid into the background, reminders that there was no clean space left in the world. Even the rice they cooked sometimes tasted like rust. He sat low, rifle angled across his lap, because you didn't put it down anymore. Fingers habitually ran over the cool barrel and the rough grip, as if checking a pulse. The sound of boots or the rustle of a uniform meant something different now. It didn't signal relief or help. It signaled movement, orders, maybe something worse. And orders, they'd become quieter, more abrupt. The officers didn't explain anymore. They didn't need to. You moved because the body knew. Hesitation could kill. There were fewer men now. He could feel it, though no one said it out loud. The camp seemed larger because of the gaps, the missing voices. Where laughter used to spill after ration meals, now there was just the sound of chewing or the click of a lighter. Even the small talk was gone. Words were a luxury. When you did speak, it was about essentials. Water, ammo, watch shifts. There wasn't room for questions like, "How's your family?" You didn't ask, because the answer might not be good, and because you couldn't bear to share your own. The birds still called, though. They didn't care. A shrill cry here, a flutter there. Sometimes they startled him, sometimes they comforted him. A bird meant something was alive and ordinary in a place where nothing felt ordinary anymore. But more often, a bird meant a thought. If something could fly, it could leave. And he couldn't. He thought about leaving, sure, everyone did, but not in the way civilians imagined. It wasn't about cowardice or surrender. It was about wondering, in quiet moments like this, what it would feel like to stop carrying so much metal, to walk without the drag of mud on your boots, to sleep without a rifle under your arm. The mind went there, especially when there was nothing else to distract it. And yet, something always interrupted. A sound. A boot scuff. The distant rumble of something too low to place. Sometimes it was nothing but wind. Sometimes it wasn't. That's why he stayed crouched, weight balanced like a coiled spring. He didn't trust quiet. Quiet meant you could hear your own doubts, and doubts were dangerous. They led to hesitation, and hesitation was a luxury the jungle punished brutally. The worst part was waiting. Waiting was its own kind of battle, fought not with bullets, but with thoughts that gnawed. He'd find himself cataloging every ache, the rawness where the rifle strap bit into his collarbone, the itch of sweat under his helmet, the persistent hunger that never quite left. He'd shift, but even movement brought discomfort. Boots rubbed raw spots on his heels, socks were never dry. The skin on his hands was cracked from cleaning the same weapon over and over. Sometimes he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. The problem was, memory was slippery now. Home didn't come in clear pictures anymore, it came in flashes. The sound of his mother's voice when she called him by his childhood name. The way his little brother used to run through rice fields with reckless feet. The smell of miso soup cooling on a low table. He'd open his eyes quickly when those thoughts came, as if caught doing something wrong. Out here, softness hurt more than wounds. He leaned against a log, ears tuned to every snap and shift around him. Somewhere, a cough. Somewhere else, the faint clink of metal. It was all normal, but nothing was safe. He adjusted his grip, more out of habit than necessity. The rifle wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was identity. Without it, he wasn't a soldier, just another scared man in a uniform. And then, there was that sound again, a rustle, too deliberate to be wind. His shoulders stiffened, and he glanced sideways without moving his head. A figure emerged, another soldier, face drawn but familiar. No threat. Just another body carrying the same weight. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. A nod was enough. In this place, words were wasted. The officer would come soon. They always did. Sometimes with a paper, sometimes with nothing but a look. And you'd follow. That was life now, one order after another, no questions asked, because questions were a kind of weakness you couldn't afford. And so he waited, listening to the jungle breathe, feeling the world shrink to the sound of his own pulse and the cool metal in his hands. Waiting, always waiting, because in war, even the silence was loaded. There was a ritual to it, almost sacred, though no one would admit that out loud. Paper wasn't easy to come by anymore, but when it appeared, folded in a jacket pocket or scavenged from a supply crate, it felt like a small rebellion against everything closing in. He would take it carefully, smoothing it on his knee, the edge of his rifle still resting nearby because you never really separated from it. The pencil stub was worn, chewed at one end. The handwriting came out crooked, more hurried than he intended, but the words mattered more than the shape of the letters. He didn't start with "Dear Mother" or "Dearest Brother." He started with facts, weather, rations, the state of his boots, as if keeping it simple would keep the fear away. Then, almost without meaning to, the sentences slipped. A mention of the sound of rain on tin. A line about a comrade who told a joke while coughing up blood. Sometimes he'd catch himself writing "I miss" and stop, the graphite leaving a smudge. It wasn't safe to promise anything. Promises belonged to a world that wasn't crumbling. The truth is, those letters were as much for him as for them. The act of writing made him feel tethered to something beyond the mud and the mosquitoes. It gave the day's shape. When you're carrying gear through heat thick enough to chew, your mind looks for small anchors. A letter became that anchor. Even if it would never be delivered, even if the paper would stay folded in a breast pocket until rain blurred the ink, it was a reminder. I am still a person. But there was another truth too. Sometimes those letters were burned. A small fire, just enough to erase what shouldn't be found if they didn't make it back. Words were dangerous. They carried your weakness, your longing, and if the enemy got them, it was like opening your chest to strangers. The thought of his family's names on foreign soil made his stomach twist. So he wrote, he folded, and sometimes he destroyed. He remembered one letter clearly, the one he didn't burn. It wasn't even long. Just a handful of sentences about a dream he'd had, his father's hands on a fishing line, the water calm and endless. He kept that one tucked deep, close to his skin, as if maybe it would keep something of him alive even if his body didn't. Nearby, other men wrote too, hunched over like students. They didn't share what they were writing. That was private, the one thing war couldn't take. But sometimes a comrade would laugh quietly, or sigh, and he'd know they were thinking of home. That sound was almost enough to break him. It reminded him that they were all ghosts in waiting, clinging to scraps of paper to feel whole. When the orders came to move, the letters went into packs or boots. Sometimes they were left behind, hidden under boards or tucked into jars, offerings to no one in particular. There was always that thin, ridiculous hope. Maybe someone would find them. Maybe someone would read the words and know they were here. And when he shouldered his rifle again, the letters still pressed against his chest, it was like carrying a second heart, one that beat softer, one that reminded him of a world that wasn't made of mud and orders. Night inside the barracks was nothing like night outside. Outside, at least the world spread wide, even if it was dangerous. There was wind, there were shadows, there was a sense of space. Inside, the walls pressed in. They weren't even proper walls, wood planks nailed together, gaps that let the damp creep through, but they trapped sound in a way that made every cough feel like a shout. Men slept inches from one another, their gear stacked close, rifles always within reach. The air was thick, a stew of sweat, mildew, and kerosene from the lamps that guttered low. When the lamps were snuffed, the dark was heavy but never quiet. There was always something, the scrape of boots as someone turned in his blanket, a whisper of two voices low enough to sound like breathing, the occasional stifled groan from a man dreaming of home or of things best forgotten. He often lay awake, staring into that blackness, counting the seconds between noises. The bodies around him were comfort and weight at the same time. Comfort, because you weren't alone. Weight, because every man was carrying his own breaking point, and you could feel it. Some men muttered in their sleep, words spilling out, names, apologies, sometimes nothing but gasps. Others lay so still it made you reach for a pulse in your own wrist. Privacy didn't exist. Not for cleaning wounds, not for writing, not even for crying, though most wouldn't dare. Emotions had to be small here. If you wept, it was with your face turned to the wall, silent. If you laughed, it was short, sharp, almost guilty. The barracks were a place where noise carried everything, tension, weariness, fear, and so you learned to make yourself small. And yet, there were moments of strange tenderness. A man offering his last cigarette to another. Someone quietly adjusting a blanket over a comrade too feverish to do it himself. A joke whispered that caught a ripple of low chuckles, despite the risk of waking the officer. Those little cracks in the silence were like light. They reminded him that the world hadn't completely turned to steel and mud. The worst sound was nothing. True, bone-deep silence, when even the breathing seemed to stop. That's when the mind wandered. Did something happen? Is someone gone? It was like waiting for a shell to fall. He'd grip his rifle tighter then, feeling the ridges of the wood under his fingers, because in the dark, touch was the only thing that grounded you. When sleep did come, it was rarely kind. Dreams were jagged, home blending with jungle, voices colliding with explosions. He'd wake sweating, unsure whether the noise he heard was memory or real. And every time, he'd think about how many more nights like this were left, how many more mornings he'd wake to another day of carrying a weight that no one at home could imagine. But there was no choice. Dawn came, whether you slept or not. The barracks emptied, men filed out, shoulders bent under gear, eyes squinting into the light. And the walls, for a few hours, could breathe again, holding on to their own ghosts until the next night returned. Breakfast wasn't really breakfast anymore. It was more like a negotiation with your stomach. The pot came around, dented and blackened, and you lined up with the others, bowl in hand if you still had one. Sometimes it was just a tin can. The rice was thin, more water than grain, and it carried the sour smell of being stretched too far. On better days, There might be a shred of dried fish or a sliver of pickled vegetable floating like treasure. Most days, though, it was just rice, swollen and soft, sticking to your teeth. He ate because there was no alternative, spooning it in quickly before it cooled and hardened. You learned not to complain. Complaining made the hunger worse, and it made others look at you differently. Everyone was thinking the same thing. We need more, but more isn't coming. Sometimes they joked about food, about bowls of hot noodles, steaming fish, grilled meat, but the jokes felt sharp, almost cruel. The act of eating became mechanical. A swallow, another swallow, no savoring. Yet, strangely, it also became sacred. That little bowl meant you could walk, carry, aim, breathe another day. Some men held their portion like it was glass, protecting it from spills or greedy glances. A dropped bowl could spark anger quick enough to feel dangerous. Hunger made tempers short. Sometimes he'd stretch the meal, saving half for later, tucking it in a cloth. The rice would harden into clumps by evening, but it was still something to chew, something to tell your body, not yet. The fear of empty hands was worse than the taste. There were rituals to it. Before eating, some bowed their heads slightly, murmuring words too quiet to catch. Others stared off, chewing as if the food wasn't there, thinking of tables far away with more than enough to feed a family. He thought of his mother's cooking sometimes, though he tried not to. The memory of a warm kitchen made the rice in his bowl taste like paper. The officers ate too, though their bowls sometimes looked fuller. It was hard not to notice. You tried not to resent it, but hunger has a way of whispering ugly things. And yet, even the officers looked thinner now. Everyone did. Belts tightened, uniforms hung loose. The war was carving them all down to bone and willpower. Occasionally, a supply crate came through, and for a brief time, meals felt almost real, cans of fish, salted plums, even sugar. Those days were rare, and they ended fast. The memory of those flavors lingered long after, turning the thin rice into an even crueler thing. When the bowls were empty, men scraped them clean with fingers, licking the grains as if they were gold. Then the bowls went back under arms, ready for the next meal, whenever it came. Hunger didn't stop, it just learned to wait. And so did he. Orders had become something strange, less like commands from men and more like echoes from somewhere far above, half-heard and unquestioned. They weren't shouted much anymore. Shouting drew attention. Instead, they were murmured, handed off like contraband, passed from one weary face to another. A nod here, a hand gesture there. A folded paper, sometimes smudged with sweat and mud, carried more weight than a speech ever could. He didn't think about why anymore. That was the unspoken rule. Don't ask. Orders didn't need reasons, they just needed to be followed. But sometimes, in the back of his mind, a quiet voice asked, who's even writing these? Who still knows the whole picture? The world had shrunk to the size of his unit, his weapon, his pack. Anything beyond was mist and rumor. Some tasks were simple: move to this ridge, carry these supplies, dig here. Others were heavier: stay silent, hold this position, don't move until told. Those ones gnawed at you because stillness was harder than motion. Your body wanted to run, but your orders kept you rooted, watching shadows that might be nothing, might be everything. And then there were the ones that unsettled everyone. Burn what can't be carried, leave what's too slow, prepare for something coming but unnamed. Those orders made men restless. You could feel it in the way they shifted, in the way questions formed on their faces but died before reaching their lips. He remembered one officer in particular, stern but not cruel, who gave an order with a look that said more than words: we do this, or none of us go home. It wasn't said, but it was understood. That was the language now. Sometimes, they carried messages too, short bursts on the radio, crackling and broken, voices they couldn't recognize. Static could feel more alive than words. And when those messages came, everyone stopped, heads tilted like hunters, catching fragments, names, numbers, warnings. Half the time they didn't even know if it was for them, but you moved anyway. The thing about orders is they stripped away choice. Choice was heavy. Choice meant blame. Following was lighter, even if it meant walking into something dark. And so he followed, boots in the mud, rifle on his shoulder, eyes fixed on the man ahead. The jungle, the hills, the roads, they became one long path of obedience. But late at night, lying in the barracks, he sometimes wondered, if the orders stopped, if no one spoke, would we keep moving? Would we even know where to go? The thought made him uneasy because the truth was simple: without orders, you were just lost men with guns, and lost men were dangerous. Out there, companionship wasn't casual, it was survival disguised as laughter. You didn't get to choose your brothers, but you learned their habits faster than family. The guy who always checked his rifle twice before sleep. The one who hummed old songs under his breath when nerves threatened to choke him. The quiet ones, the talkative ones, the ones who tried too hard to be brave, all of them became mirrors, each showing some part of yourself you weren't ready to admit. They ate together, even when there wasn't much to eat. They crouched in circles, backs pressed to whatever cover they could find, bowls or cans balanced on knees. Sometimes they traded bites, like children. It wasn't about generosity, it was about acknowledging hunger as something shared, a beast that chewed on all of them. A cigarette passed around felt like communion. One drag for each man. No one hogged it, not because they were saints, but because they couldn't afford to be selfish. Talking was different here. At home, conversations wandered. Out here, words were sharper, quicker. A joke could cut tension like a knife, and a well-timed curse could bring out a short burst of laughter that felt like a gift. They talked about food, women, sports, anything that reminded them of a life beyond the mud and the orders. No one talked about fear, but it hung between them like smoke. They all smelled it, even if they never said the word. Sometimes the strongest bonds were silent. A nod across the camp. A hand steadying another as he cleaned a rifle. The sharing of water when the canteens were almost empty. These gestures mattered more than speeches. They said, "I see you and you matter, even if none of us matter to the war anymore." They teased each other, too, because teasing was safer than pity. The young ones took the brunt of it, about their haircuts, their boots, the way they carried a pack. But underneath, there was something protective in the ribbing. Better to laugh at the greenhorn than to let him see how scared you were for him. Night brought its own rituals. When the lamps were low and the watch was posted, some men told stories, half true, half remembered. One would talk about fishing trips with his father. Another would brag about a girl back home who was definitely waiting. Someone else might start a ghost story, soft-voiced, just enough to make the darkness feel alive. And always, someone would eventually fall silent, staring into the black, thinking about things they'd never say. There were quarrels, of course. Hunger and exhaustion made tempers flare. A missing can of food. A misplaced tool. A careless word about courage. But the fights burned quick. Someone would step in, maybe an older soldier, maybe a friend, and things would settle. You couldn't afford grudges when the man you argued with might be the one covering your back tomorrow. He remembered a moment when one comrade, skinny, quiet, found a small bird's nest tucked in a branch during a break. The eggs were tiny, blue-gray, fragile. Instead of crushing them for food, as some might have, he only looked, then gently set the branch back. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them, a shared understanding that even here, some things were too precious to break. The truth was, these men became your whole world. You memorized their faces, even in low light. You could pick out their breathing at night, could tell who was sick, who was pretending not to be. And when someone didn't show up at roll call, you noticed immediately. Loss was fast here, it didn't give warning. And when it came, the silence that followed was heavier than any pack. That's why they laughed when they could, even at things that weren't funny. Because the alternative was unbearable. The gear never really left your body. Even when you stripped it off for a few minutes to breathe, it felt like phantom weight, shoulders still pulled down, hips still aching under straps that had rubbed skin raw. The rifle was the first thing you reached for in the morning, the last thing you touched at night. It wasn't just a weapon anymore, it was a part of you, a limb you didn't dare lose. And it was heavy, not just in metal, but in meaning. The pack sat high, but it always felt like it was sinking lower, dragging you closer to the ground. Inside was everything that kept you alive, a few rounds of ammunition, a canteen that was never full enough, a tin of rice, maybe a scrap of cloth to wrap a wound. Each item had its own sound: the clink of steel, the dull thud of wood, the faint slosh of water, and those sounds became familiar music, a reminder that you were still equipped to keep moving. But the body has limits. The straps bit into bone, the pack rubbed the same spots until they blistered, then broke, then healed, then broke again. Sweat soaked the padding, then dried stiff with salt. His hands were hard now, calloused from the rifle's grip, but even calluses split when they were worked too long. And there was the heat. Heat made everything worse. It seeped into your helmet, pooled in your boots, made your clothes cling like second skin. The steel of the rifle got so hot sometimes that it burned your palm if you weren't careful. You shifted the weight, adjusted the straps, but nothing made it lighter. What surprised him was how normal it became. The human body adapts, even when it shouldn't. What once felt unbearable turned into background noise. You stopped thinking about comfort and started thinking in terms of efficiency: how to move without wasting energy, how to drink without spilling a drop, how to sleep sitting up with the rifle across your knees. The duty part was harder than the steel. Every pound you carried reminded you why you were there, even if you didn't fully understand anymore. Orders didn't explain themselves, and the bigger picture was foggy at best. But the weight kept you honest. It said, "This is real." It said, "Someone expects you to stand when standing feels impossible." Sometimes the gear became a shield. The bulk of it between you and whatever waited in the trees gave a strange sense of safety, even if it was an illusion. Other times, it felt like a curse: too much to run fast, too much to hide quietly. You hated it, but you couldn't be without it. He'd watch the younger ones fumble with theirs, straps twisted, packs too loose, rifles swinging awkwardly. A quiet curse, a quick adjustment, and then the line kept moving. Everyone learned fast or got left behind. But there were moments when the steel wasn't just steel. When they camped, the rifle became a pillow, the pack a seat. The bayonet, when not fixed to the muzzle, was a knife for cutting vines, even bread when there was any. The gear was everything: tool, weapon, burden, companion. He sometimes wondered about the men who designed it. Did they know what it felt like to carry? Did they understand the small miseries of weight, that a half-pound of metal could mean the difference between steady aim and shaking hands? Probably not. That was the thing about wars: the ones who carried the least often asked for the most. But the men beside him carried it too, and there was something in that shared load. When a comrade's strap broke, you helped him fix it. When someone fell, you took some of his weight, because tomorrow he might carry yours. No one said, "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude, it was survival. There were lighter moments too. A soldier balancing his pack on his head to make the others laugh. Another using his helmet as a bull. These small absurdities reminded them that even beasts of burden found ways to grin. And at the end of a long march, when the pack finally slid off your shoulders, there was no sweeter relief. It didn't matter where you dropped it: in mud, in dust, against a tree. The body sighed, even if the mind didn't. For a brief moment, you stood taller, shoulders free, and felt almost human again. But always, before sleep, you checked it once more, adjusted the rifle, because if something happened in the night, you wanted the weight back on your side. Duty was a strange thing. It wasn't about flags or slogans anymore. It was about the man next to you, about not letting him down, about walking when your legs wanted to give. The steel reminded you, every step, every ache, that you weren't done yet. The jungle was alive, even when men were trying to kill each other. It wasn't quiet, not really, not like the barracks when everyone held their breath. It hummed and whispered and sometimes roared, and you learned quickly that the sounds were as much enemy as comfort. In the early days, he thought the noise would drive him mad. Cicadas shrieked so loudly they felt like drills in the skull. Birds laughed from the canopy, mocking and sharp. Things moved where you couldn't see them. Even the leaves seemed to have their own language. But after weeks, the music of it all began to arrange itself into something like a map. The jungle told you things if you listened carefully. A sudden hush in the chatter of birds might mean something larger was moving. A low growl might mean a boar, or worse. The whir of insects could tell you about water nearby, or about rot, about death. The sound of your own men became part of it, too. The swish of a uniform brushing against vines, the faint metallic click of a rifle safety, The wet suck of boots pulling free of mud, these were familiar notes, and they carried their own meanings. A stumble could send a flock of birds screaming skyward, giving you away. A cough could echo like a gunshot. At night, it changed. The jungle grew teeth. Frogs throbbed like drums, owls cut through with cries that sounded almost human, and everything smelled thicker. The air seemed to buzz, heavy with things unseen. Every creak of a branch could be wind or something worse. His fingers often rested on his rifle in the dark, not because he expected to shoot, but because it was the only thing that felt solid when the rest of the world was a shifting wall of sound. The strangest moments were the still ones. Occasionally, the jungle went silent. No birds, no insects, just the weight of damp air pressing in. Those were the moments that made your skin crawl. Silence here didn't feel like peace, it felt like the moment before something broke. He began to notice beauty too, though he'd never have admitted it. The colors were sharper than anything back home, deep greens, sudden flashes of red or blue from birds or flowers. Streams glinted like silver threads when the light hit just right. Even the smell of rain coming through leaves was almost sweet, a reminder that nature was indifferent to men's madness. Sometimes, when they paused on a march, he caught himself watching a butterfly hover near a puddle and wondered how something so fragile could survive in a place where everything else seemed built to tear. But beauty could be cruel. The jungle hid things. It hid men, weapons, traps. It swallowed sounds and spat them back wrong. More than once, they'd seen nothing until a shot rang out from nowhere. More than once, a man went into the trees and didn't come back. That's why they learned to read each other's faces as much as they read the terrain. A flick of the eyes, a clenched jaw, a raised hand all became part of the music. And under it all, the low thrum of tension never went away. Water was another kind of sound here. Streams babbled softly, but they could give you away. A splash might bring eyes your way. Still, they needed it, so they crouched by rivers, filled canteens fast, sometimes tasted mud when the flow was low. The sound of someone drinking became intimate, private, almost desperate. And always, there were footsteps, soft, hard, quick, slow. Boots wore paths into the forest floor, but the earth took them back quickly. A trail could vanish overnight, swallowed by vines and leaves. That was the jungle's promise. Nothing here lasted long, not even men. Sometimes, on a rare clear day, they heard the distant boom of artillery or the low growl of engines. Those noises were different, they didn't belong. They cut through the wild music like glass, reminding everyone that no matter how alive the jungle seemed, war was louder. In the end, the sounds became a kind of company. When fear edged too close, when orders made no sense, when hunger gnawed, the jungle filled the gaps. Its voices were everywhere. Some men hated it. Some found strange comfort in it. For him, it was both enemy and friend, a constant reminder that the world was bigger than this tiny patch of mud and blood. And when he lay down at night, pack his pillow, rifle across his chest, it was those sounds, the buzz, the hiss, the chirp, that carried him to what little rest he could steal. The jungle's music never stopped, it just changed keys. Information was a luxury, and in those days it came in fragments, half-whispered, smudged with fear, stretched thin like the last grains of rice in the pot. There were no official bulletins, no neat timelines, just words passed from one tired soldier to another, changing shape each time they moved. Rumors were the only currency, and they were everywhere, slipping through the camp like ghosts, light enough to vanish, heavy enough to haunt. One man swore he'd heard a radio transmission about a big offensive, something decisive. Another insisted the enemy was breaking, starving, ready to fold. Someone else said the opposite, that reinforcements were coming, endless waves of them, with planes and tanks. No one knew what to believe. Belief itself felt dangerous. When the truth was a fog, every shadow could look like a rescue or a threat. It wasn't just about battles either. They talked about home in the same uncertain way. Someone claimed his cousin had written that Tokyo was burning. Someone else whispered about families fleeing to the countryside. Letters, if they came at all, were riddled with gaps. Words were blacked out, whole paragraphs missing, and you learned to read the silences more than the ink. What made it worse was how quickly these rumors took root. A single word could sprout a dozen more. By evening, a dropped comment about hearing something on the radio could turn into a full-blown narrative about victory or defeat. The younger men clung to them, their faces brightening or dimming with each twist. The older ones didn't say much, just smoked and kept their eyes on the dirt. They'd learned that hope was as sharp as despair. Some rumors were ridiculous, but no one laughed. Stories of secret weapons, of allies coming from the sea, of miraculous turns. Maybe someone believed them. Maybe they just needed to. Anything to cut through the sameness of mud, steel, and hunger. There were darker whispers too. Things about dwindling supplies, about units cut off and never heard from again. Stories about prisoners, about what happened if you were captured, or if you captured someone else. Those ones were harder to shake. Men didn't look at each other when they told them. He noticed something about rumors. They were never about the present. They were always about what had happened somewhere else, or what was about to happen just out of reach. They lived in the spaces between facts, feeding on the tension of waiting. And when you were waiting for orders, waiting for movement, waiting for something to break, rumors filled the silence like wind in an empty house. Sometimes they were useful. Sometimes they kept you alert. A whispered warning could make a man keep his head down at the right time. Other times, they were poison, making you see enemies in every shadow. He remembered one day when a rumor spread that enemy scouts were nearby. The whole unit moved like a coiled spring, nerves on edge, only to find nothing but trees. That night, everyone was quieter. The strangest thing was how the rumors tied them together. Even if they were wrong, even if they changed by the hour, they reminded each man that something bigger was out there. A world still moved beyond their campfires and marches. And maybe, just maybe, someone somewhere knew how this would all end. For now, though, they kept talking. They leaned close over their bowls, their cigarettes, their rifles, sharing bits of news like crumbs. Because a rumor, even a bad one, was better than silence. You'd think by now he would know what the enemy looked like, but most days, they were only shapes in his mind, faces pieced together from propaganda posters, glimpses through trees, stories told around low fires. War has a way of making the other side both bigger and smaller than life. They became shadows you feared and men you pitted, sometimes in the same breath. In the early days, when the war was still something that carried speeches and flags, there were lessons drilled into them about who they were fighting. Charts, photographs, bold claims about weakness and cruelty. They were told the enemy was soft, indulgent, unprepared for sacrifice. They were told the enemy was ruthless, determined to destroy everything they knew. The contradictions were never questioned. They just sank in like background noise. But when you were the one standing in the thick, with mud creeping into your boots and your rifle the only sure thing, the enemy wasn't an idea anymore. They were out there somewhere, breathing the same air, sweating under their own packs. You imagine them moving when the jungle rustled. Imagine their eyes scanning the same ground. Imagine their fingers on triggers just like yours. It made you walk quieter, grip tighter, blink less. And yet, the mystery made them almost human. One night, when the rain came so heavy it blurred everything into silver sheets, he heard laughter, not theirs, not his, just laughter somewhere beyond the line. It carried strangely in the wet air, warm and sudden, and it was impossible not to think, someone on the other side misses home too. Someone's stomach growls. Someone's writing letters they'll never send. But those softer thoughts couldn't stay. You couldn't afford them. Because then there were the other sounds, rifle cracks from the dark, the thump of something heavy hitting the ground, the smell of cordite on the air. Those moments snapped everything back. The enemy wasn't a boy with a smile. He was the shadow behind the muzzle flash. They rarely saw them up close. Skirmishes were flashes of movement, quick bursts, men falling before you knew their names. The faces, when they did appear, were almost too much to look at. They were young. They were old. They were tired. They were you reversed. He remembered one prisoner once, thin as a reed, trembling under the weight of more fear than gear. The boy couldn't have been more than 18. It unsettled him, how familiar the posture was, how familiar the hunger in his eyes. And then there were stories. Stories about what the enemy did if they caught you, stories about what they suffered when caught themselves. Each story added layers to the imagined face, making it sharper or darker depending on who told it. Some soldiers swore the enemy was everywhere, invisible and clever. Others said they were clumsy, easy to outthink. The truth was probably both. He tried not to think too much about it, but the mind wanders, especially in the still hours. You wondered if the enemy thought of you too. Did they hear your boots? Did they imagine your face? Was someone out there telling a story about the cruel soldier in the shadows? Sometimes, the imagining was worse than the fighting. A branch snapped and the mind spun pictures, a knife at the throat, a shot from the trees, a man rising from the earth itself. The jungle didn't help, it made everything sound closer, bigger. Fear sharpened every guess. The older soldiers had a trick for it. They stopped imagining. They moved with heads down, eyes forward, as if the only enemy worth worrying about was the ground underfoot. He envied that kind of blankness, but he couldn't quite get there. At night, when the lamps were low, his mind still painted the faces of men he might never meet, faces he might have to aim at before they aimed at him. And every now and then, something unexpected happened. They'd find signs left behind, an old camp, a half-eaten meal, footprints. Evidence of lives lived just out of reach. Sometimes it was a carved name in a tree, sometimes a scrap of paper. Each one said the same thing: someone was here. Someone might be watching. In the end, the enemy's face was never one thing. It was hunger. It was fear. It was resolve. It was a reflection in the barrel of his own rifle. And he knew, deep down, that whatever they looked like, whatever language they spoke, they were probably asking the same question he was, under all the noise. How long do we keep doing this? It started small, just a faint hum, the kind that pricks the back of your neck before your ears catch up. Out here, sound always came before sight. Men would pause mid-step, rifles rising slightly, the chatter stopping on its own. A second later, it would grow, a low, steady drone that seemed to pour straight out of the clouds. Engines. By now, they knew that sound too well. The first time they heard it months ago, some craned their necks, curious, like children watching a kite. Now no one looked up for long. Eyes were for the ground, for cover. The sky belonged to the other side. And then you saw them, specks at first, like dust against blue or gray, then growing, forming lines or arcs. Bombers, fighters, scouts, it didn't matter. They were all bad news. Even if they weren't coming for you, they were coming for someone, and the earth always seemed to answer back. When they did come, the air changed. It thickened, somehow heavier, as though even breathing took more work. The first whistle was almost delicate, like a pipe dropped somewhere far off. Then came the crash. Not just sound, but force, something that shook your bones before your mind caught up. It was the waiting that killed you. Bombs didn't drop in rhythm. They came when they came, each one a question mark. You could be crouched in a trench, listening to someone pray under their breath, and the next second the world would come apart. The smell after a raid was like nothing else: metal, dust, smoke, and something sweet you didn't want to name. Fires caught on anything willing: dry leaves, old planks, scraps of canvas. Black smoke climbed fast, twisting into shapes the wind tore apart. Sometimes, long after the last plane was gone, the sky stayed streaked with that smoke, and you'd catch yourself staring, thinking it looked like writing you couldn't read. What made it worse was how far away it all seemed. The pilots were just specks. You never saw their faces, never heard their voices. They were ghosts with engines. They could level a place and never know your name. That kind of power was hard to think about, so most men didn't. They just kept their heads down and moved when told. But you couldn't ignore the aftermath. Once the roar faded and the ringing in your ears dulled, you saw what was left. Trees split like matchsticks. Ground ripped open. Sometimes pieces of things you didn't want to recognize. The jungle healed fast, but not fast enough to hide everything. They learned tricks. You counted seconds after the whistle, you moved fast, you made yourself small. Helmets stayed close, rifles stayed closer. The veterans could tell by the pitch what was coming. The young ones froze. Everyone learned eventually, or they didn't last. What stuck with him wasn't just the sound, but the light. At night, the raids turned the world inside out. Flares hung like stars, lighting up the leaves in eerie white. Explosions threw up orange and red, shadows leaping like mad things. For a moment, it was almost beautiful, like some hellish festival you weren't invited to leave. He thought of home during those times, not because he wanted to, but because the noise made it impossible not to. He imagined his family looking at the same sky, calm and dark, while his world burned. Sometimes that thought gave him strength. Sometimes it hollowed him out. The worst part was the quiet afterward. When the planes were gone and the fires were smoldering, when the only sounds were boots on ash and the hiss of cooling metal, something settled heavy in the chest. Men counted heads. They didn't say names out loud, but they looked for faces. When one wasn't there, the silence grew. And then they moved again. You always moved again. The war didn't care about your ears ringing or your hands shaking. It didn't care about the faces you'd just lost. Orders came, boots lifted, rifles swung back into position. The sky was quiet again for now. The jungle floor was never really steady. Roots twisted like veins beneath the mud, rocks jutted out of nowhere, and rain softened everything until your boots sank with every step. But there's a difference between soft ground and shaking ground, and when the earth began to move, even just a little, every man felt it in his spine. It usually started small, just a vibration, like something deep under the soil was waking up. A cup rattling on a board. A tin spoon tapping against a canteen. He'd seen hardened men go still like deer, heads lifting as if their ears could reach the tremor. Sometimes it was a false alarm, thunder far away, or maybe an animal big enough to make the earth shrug. But too often it wasn't. The shells didn't always scream on their way in. Some whistled, some hissed, some just arrived with a violence so sudden it didn't seem fair. The first hit was the worst, no warning, no rhythm, just a blast that stole the air from your lungs and turned the world into shards. The ground jumped. Trees shook. Leaves came down like rain. There was no elegance to it, no strategy you could see from the dirt. All you knew was that someone, somewhere, was aiming at a map, and you were the mark. The impact wasn't just heard, it was felt. A punch in the chest, a slap in the ears, a taste of grit in the teeth. You learned to drop fast, to make yourself as small as possible, face pressed to the earth that was being torn apart above you. Your rifle dug into your ribs, your helmet rang against your skull, but you didn't move. Moving meant exposing. Moving meant standing. And standing meant maybe not standing again. The strangest part was the waiting. After the first few hits, time stretched thin. Seconds became hours. You waited for the next one, wondering if it was yours. The silence between blasts was worse than the noise. It made your breath too loud, your thoughts too sharp. And when the next one came, you always jumped, no matter how ready you thought you were. Men didn't talk during barrages. They didn't even look at each other. The noise was too big and the fear was too private. Some prayed into the dirt. Some bit down on their sleeves. Some just stared, eyes wide, as if memorizing the earth's color. When it ended, and it always ended, somehow the silence was heavy. Ears rang for minutes. Dust hung in the air, thick and choking. You looked around, counting shapes. Someone might cough. Someone might not get up. And then came the quick inventory. Check your gear, check your limbs, check your friends. The damage was never neat. Craters where there used to be paths. Shattered trees. Sometimes worse. And you couldn't stop. Orders pushed you forward, sometimes even over the ground that had just bucked you like a horse. There was something cruel about that, no pause to mourn, no pause to breathe. Just keep moving. Even when there was no shelling, the memory of it stayed. Your feet never trusted the earth again. A tremor of thunder could make your stomach clench. A stick breaking could raise your pulse. The body remembered every shake. But it also learned something. Every man out there carried the memory of those blasts in his muscles, and it made them quicker, sharper, harder to catch off guard. Survival demanded it. You learned to feel the weight shift in the ground, to notice the birds going silent, to read the tension in a comrade's jaw. The earth spoke before it screamed, if you listened closely enough. Even at night, lying on a thin mat or nothing at all, he could feel the memory of those tremors, like a ghost tapping under the floor. Sometimes he wondered if the earth was tired of all this noise, if it resented being torn and burned by men who'd be dust soon enough. The thought passed quickly, but not without leaving a mark. When the ground shook, you didn't think about why. You didn't think about politics or maps or victories. You thought about staying as small as possible, keeping your heart where it belonged, and hoping the earth calmed down before your nerves broke. And when it finally did, you stood up, brushed off the dirt, and carried on like nothing happened, because what else was there to do? When the earth finally stopped shaking and the ringing dulled, men did what they always did: stood, counted, moved. But after a barrage, something quieter always settled. It was in the way hands lingered on lucky charms, the way a man touched the photo folded in his breast pocket, the way another glanced at a tiny piece of paper tucked inside his helmet lining. You could almost feel it in the air. Everyone had something hidden, something that didn't belong to the mud and steel. That's how you survived, not just on food and orders, but on small, secret things. Some carried charms from temples, smooth beads worn shiny by sweat. Others carried notes, bits of poetry, even pressed flowers wrapped in oilcloth. He had something too, though he never showed it. A tiny wooden carving, crude but precious, cut by his younger brother before he left. It wasn't much bigger than a coin, but it had weight in his hand. Reminder that someone once made something only for him. These weren't just trinkets. They were anchors. When the world shook, when the noise roared, you needed something to pull you back. Even a scrap of paper could remind you that life had edges beyond the jungle. The shrines were everywhere if you looked closely. A photograph tucked behind a pack strap, a name etched in the handle of a bayonet, a letter folded and refolded until the ink blurred. Some soldiers made them right there, carving little marks into tree bark, stacking stones in quiet corners. It wasn't religion exactly, though some prayed. It was more like staking a claim: I was here, and I am still me. It made sense after the chaos. Shelling stripped away illusions. You could die for a map you'd never seen, under orders you barely understood. So you learned to hold tighter to what you could touch. He remembered one man, older, who kept a tiny piece of fabric sewn into his sleeve. No one knew what it was until one night, during a watch shift, the man took it out, part of his daughter's dress. She was wearing it when I left, he said simply, then tucked it back without another word. No one teased him. No one dared. The jungle seemed indifferent to these things, but maybe it noticed. In the dim light, those shrines seemed to glow a little, a defiance against decay. And maybe that's why they were hidden, not because men were ashamed, but because something sacred doesn't survive well in open air. And after the quiet moments passed, the packs went back on, rifles lifted, faces hardened again. But those little pieces stayed, pressed close to hearts or tucked in boots. And when they moved forward, it wasn't just steel they carried. Which made the next thing, the night watches, even harder. Because it's one thing to carry hope, it's another to guard it in the dark, where everything moves and nothing is sure. It's strange how something so fragile, a photograph, a carving, a folded scrap of paper, could make men harder, steadier. Maybe that's why, after those quiet moments with their hidden keepsakes, the mood among them shifted. They didn't talk about what they carried, not directly, but something softened around the edges. You could see it when a man passed his canteen without being asked, or when someone adjusted another's strap without a word. The shrines they hid in their pockets spilled over into how they treated each other. And that's how friendships were made here, not with long conversations or shared meals, but with small, silent acts. Mud was everywhere. It swallowed boots, soaked uniforms, coated skin until you hardly recognized your own hands. You'd think something so filthy would push men apart, but it didn't. If anything, it stuck them together. They were brothers by necessity. You learned their habits quickly: who limped when tired, who got jumpy at night, who needed an extra second before firing. These weren't things you could ask, you just noticed. You noticed because your life might depend on it. The jokes came anyway, because if you didn't laugh, the weight would crush you. They teased each other about home, about women they swore were waiting, about the way someone's helmet looked too big. The laughter was short, sharp, but it was a kind of medicine. Even the quietest men joined in sometimes, a brief grin flashing before the mask dropped again. In the mud, when everything else blurred, loyalty stood out like a flare. A man's hand reaching to pull another from a trench that had turned into a pool. A quick shoulder offered when someone stumbled under their pack. A share of cigarettes when there was only one left. None of these moments were planned. They just happened, because here you understood instinctively what you gave today might come back tomorrow. There were arguments too. Hunger and exhaustion have a way of fraying tempers. Voices rose, fists sometimes followed. But the fights burned quick and cooled quicker. No one stayed angry long. They couldn't. The man you'd cursed at noon might be the only one covering your back at midnight. He remembered a night when rain turned the ground to soup and a young soldier, barely more than a boy, slipped face first into the muck. Everyone laughed, even the boy, mud dripping from his chin. And then, without hesitation, the oldest among them reached down, hauled him up, and handed over a rag. No lecture, no joke, just a quick clap on the shoulder. It was nothing, but it was everything. That was the strange truth. War made friendships feel both fragile and indestructible. Fragile, because any shell or bullet could shatter them in a blink. Indestructible, because the bond formed under that weight couldn't be faked. They didn't need to say much. A nod, a look, a shared silence was enough to know I see you. I'll stand with you. And as the rain washed away some of the mud, the bond stayed. Stronger than steel, lighter than the packs they carried. Those friendships weren't written about, not in letters, not in reports. But they were there, stamped into the earth like footprints that would fade but never really disappear. It's why the next moments, when the body began to break and the mind started to betray itself, mattered so much. Because when hunger or fever came, it wasn't orders or discipline that kept a man upright, it was often the friend beside him, the one who'd give up his last bit of rice or help clean a wound no one wanted to see. And that's where it led him, to the quiet truth that friendship in this place wasn't soft. It was gritty, raw, and sometimes it hurt. But it was real. And it was the only thing that made the next day's burdens bearable. Those bonds mattered most when the body finally stopped pretending. Because no matter how tough a man acted, no matter how many laughs he gave away, his bones, muscles, and skin told the real story. The mud and the weight, the endless miles, the hunger, they all left marks. And every mark talked back. At first, you ignored it. Everyone did. Blisters were just blisters. A sore shoulder just meant you'd carried your rifle right. But the days kept stacking and small aches turned into something else. Your boots rubbed until the skin came off, leaving raw patches that stung with every step. Hands cracked and bled from cleaning the same weapon again and again. Knees stiffened after long watches, refusing to straighten at dawn. The stomach was the cruelest. Rice, thin and watery, was no match for the energy burned just staying alive. Hunger carved into the face, sharpened the jawline, hollowed the cheeks. It wasn't dramatic, it was slow. One morning you'd notice the belt needed another hole. Another night you'd feel ribs when you scratched an itch. Illness crept in too. Fevers came without asking, sometimes from bad water, sometimes from a mosquito's whisper. Dysentery spread fast when supplies thinned, leaving men weak, humiliated, doubled over in the brush. Even a small cut, left unwashed, could swell into something dangerous. The jungle didn't forgive neglect. And still, the body kept going. That was the strange part, how much it could take before breaking. A man could carry a fever for days, his pack heavier than his weight, and still march because there was no other option. The brain learned tricks, how to turn pain into background noise, how to make hunger feel like focus. But at night, when the camp went quiet, the body told the truth. Legs throbbed. Shoulders burned. Fingers cramped from gripping a rifle too long. Men slept in awkward positions, half sitting, boots still on, helmets as pillows, because even the act of lying flat seemed to take too much effort. Sometimes the friendships they'd forged were the only reason they could rest. Someone would keep watch while another dozed, someone would share a drink, someone would help lift a pack in the morning. The smallest kindnesses mattered more than orders. Even the mind wasn't spared. Nerves frayed easily. A sudden sound could make the heart race. Dreams carried explosions that hadn't happened yet. Some men spoke less and less, retreating into themselves. Others talked too much, words spilling fast like water breaking through a dam. He started to notice how memory lived in the muscles. A sound made him crouch before thinking. A flicker of light made his finger tighten on the trigger. The body was writing its own language, teaching him to survive in ways his brain couldn't keep up with. And there were moments when the body just stopped listening. A fever that wouldn't break. A cough that wouldn't stop. The tremor in the hands when loading a magazine. That's when the weight of friendship returned, someone else lifting part of your burden, a hand steadying yours, a quiet voice telling you to drink. The truth was brutal but clear. The body kept score, but it also kept trying. Even when thin and bruised, even when exhausted and shaking, it carried on because there was no other choice. That's what war asked of men, to keep standing when standing seemed impossible. And it was about to ask more. Orders had started to change tone again. They were sharper now, shorter. Something was building, something that would take everything left in them. And that meant the next steps, the strange commands, the confusion, the quiet defiance, would matter even more. The body could only bend so far before it started talking back, but it was the orders that tested the mind. After days of mud, after nights of watch and shelling and fever, words from above began to sound less like direction and more like noise. They came at odd hours, sometimes whispered, sometimes barked, sometimes nothing more than a scribble passed down the line. And more often than not, they didn't add up. Hold this position. Hold what? A strip of jungle barely wide enough for 3 men? Move at dawn. Move where? The maps were faded, the landmarks blurred by rain. Sometimes the commands were clear, but pointless. Dig here, then dig again somewhere else. Carry supplies no one seemed to use. Men didn't argue, but you could feel the question mark hanging in the air. He followed like the rest, boots sinking into earth, rifle slung tight, but inside, the quiet voice was growing louder. Why? It wasn't disloyalty, it was exhaustion. It was the mind wanting a reason when the body had none left to give. One day, they were told to burn what couldn't be carried, papers, extra rations, even a few keepsakes. No explanation, just fire in the rain. Another time, they were ordered to move toward a sound no one could identify. The younger ones looked around, wide-eyed, but the older men just shouldered their packs and went. That's what you did. You moved. But in those moments, something changed. You stopped believing in a big picture. You started believing only in the man ahead of you and the pack on your back. The officers weren't unkind, just tired too. You could see it in their eyes, the strain of trying to make sense of something larger than all of them. Sometimes, the rumors grew louder than the orders, especially when both seemed to clash. One voice said retreat. Another said advance. Radios crackled, then died. The chain of command felt thinner than ever, and out there, thin chain snapped. Yet, there was still loyalty, though it shifted shape. It wasn't about flags anymore, it was about habits. You listened because listening kept you alive. Disobedience wasn't bravery, it was risk, and risk could take more than just you. The hardest part was when the orders touched something human. A comrade left behind, a path abandoned. The jungle swallowed things quick, and sometimes the command was clear, you can't go back. Those were the orders that stung. Men carried them like stones, silent and heavy. And yet, through all the confusion, they moved. Packs shifted, boots lifted, rifles rose. The questions burned quietly, but they never stopped the march. Maybe it was faith, maybe it was fear, maybe it was just the understanding that in a world that made little sense, forward was the only direction left. Which is why the next moments, the little rebellions, the subtle choices to act when told to wait, stood out. They weren't about betrayal, they were about being human. And soon, when the shadows stretched long and the silence became too loud, some of those choices would matter more than any order. Orders moved the body, but they couldn't always quiet the mind. And when the weight of commands stacked too high, when fatigue made every step feel like pushing against the tide, there were moments when a soldier's humanity leaked through. They were small things, almost invisible, but in a war that demanded obedience, they were daring. It might be as simple as pausing an extra second before rising when told to march, stealing one more breath of air. Sometimes it was letting a comrade catch up even when the column pushed ahead. It could be saving a scrap of food you were told to throw away, or speaking a forbidden name into the dark when everyone else pretended not to miss home. He felt it himself. The orders were relentless, and most of the time they made sense in the way habits make sense. You followed because not following was dangerous. But every so often, something inside resisted, just a little. He'd glance at a tree he was told to ignore, peer longer into the hills than was necessary, tighten his grip when told to loosen it. Small things. Tiny rebellions. And sometimes it wasn't about disobedience at all, it was about mercy. A captured radio hidden instead of destroyed because maybe they'd need it later. A wounded bird moved from a path so the boots didn't crush it. Once, a fellow soldier gave his last cigarette to a boy they'd found trembling in a burned-out hut, even though sharing with locals was discouraged. These were not grand gestures. They weren't the kind of things that changed a war. But in the grind of it all, they were reminders. We are still people. They broke the rhythm for a heartbeat, just long enough to let you remember there was a world before the mud, and maybe a world after. The officers weren't blind. They saw the pauses, the glances, the whispers. Sometimes they turned away. Perhaps they understood, perhaps they were guilty of the same. Everyone carried a line they wouldn't cross, but everyone also carried a point where rules bent. The defiance could turn sharper too. A man refusing to leave behind a comrade's body even when told to. Someone pocketing a round or two of ammunition when ordered to dump weight. Another sharing water with someone outside the unit. These were risks, but they were also choices. And in a world stripped of choices, even the smallest one felt like taking back a piece of yourself. It wasn't always noble. Sometimes it was just stubbornness. The older ones were the worst for it. They'd been through enough to know when an order was nonsense. They'd mutter under their breath, slow their steps, at a glance that said more than words. The younger men watched and learned. You could follow and still think. The quietest acts, though, were the ones no one talked about. A letter tucked into a stranger's pack in case you didn't make it. A handful of rice left for someone who hadn't eaten. A prayer whispered for both sides when no one else was listening. And then the moment passed. The pack shifted, the boots moved, the rifle was lifted again. The jungle swallowed the little rebellion whole. But for that instant, the war belonged to them and not the other way around. It was a fragile balance, obey enough to survive, resist enough to stay human. And as the nights stretched longer and the watches grew colder, those tiny acts became as important as any ration. They kept something alive inside, which mattered most when the sun went down, when the trees became black walls, and when every shadow seemed to breathe. Because at night, there was no officer's gaze, no radio crackle, just a soldier, his rifle, and whatever small spark of self he'd saved for himself during the day. And that's when he learned that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't shooting or marching, it was watching. It was staying awake when the world slept, trusting your own eyes when orders had long since gone quiet. When the orders stopped echoing and the camp sank into its uneasy rest, the war didn't stop, it just changed shape. The noise of the day gave way to something sharper, silence threaded with small, unpredictable sounds. That was the night watch, and for a single soldier, it could feel like the loneliest post in the world. It always started the same. You were tapped on the shoulder or called by name, and your body, already half asleep, forced itself upright. Boots back on if you'd taken them off. Rifle checked, magazine tapped, sling adjusted. Some men muttered a curse under their breath, some said nothing. There was no choice. You went because you were told, but also because you knew someone else had gone for you the night before. The world looked different at night. The same trees that looked harmless under the sun turned into walls of black. The paths blurred. Even the stars seemed wrong, hidden by clouds or branches, or burning brighter than you remembered. And the sounds, they were everywhere. A frog croaking could sound like boots in the mud. A branch breaking might be a deer, or might not. He learned quickly that the hardest part of a watch wasn't seeing, it was hearing. Every sound was a question. Every shift in the wind carried something unknown. You listened with everything, straining to separate normal from dangerous. The insects, the distant water, even the breath of sleeping men behind you, They became a kind of music. When a note changed, your pulse did too. Sleep was the enemy. It came like fog, soft and slow, creeping up on heavy eyelids. You fought it with pinches, with quiet steps back and forth, with whispered songs to yourself. Some chewed coffee grounds, if they had them. Others smoked slowly, letting the glow of a cigarette die before it gave them away. The fear was different at night. It wasn't the panic of shelling or the rush of a charge. It was colder, slower, like someone drawing a line around you. You knew how thin the watch really was, one man awake for many asleep. One rifle between the shadows and your brothers. It made your heart beat louder than seemed safe. Sometimes, the watch brought strange peace. When nothing moved and the moon was high, when the air cooled and the jungle seemed to hold its breath, you could almost forget. You could imagine yourself on a quiet hill at home, keeping an eye on fields instead of foxholes. Those moments were rare and they never lasted. A rustle, a call of a bird, the memory of an order, and you were back. The strangest part was when the night revealed things the day never did. You noticed who tossed in their sleep, who muttered names, who woke sweating. You saw the outlines of men curled around their packs, protective even in dreams. It made you protective too. And then, just as the mind began to wander, something would happen. A noise too deliberate. A flash of light. The faint smell of smoke. Adrenaline would spike so fast it left you trembling, breath shallow, finger tight on the trigger. Most times, it was nothing an animal, a tree settling, the wind. But the night didn't forgive mistakes, and one wrong sound could mean everyone waking to chaos. There were the other dangers too, the mind itself. Too much quiet could pull up things you didn't want, faces you missed, mistakes you made, thoughts about home. You'd think about family, friends, meals you didn't finish. Sometimes the weight of it pressed harder than the pack on your back. But dawn always came. It was slow, gray first, then gold bleeding through the leaves. The first bird call felt like a friend returning. You'd feel lighter, not rested, but relieved. When the next man touched your shoulder to take over, you handed the rifle like passing a secret, and you lay down without ceremony, heart still racing but grateful for a few hours to disappear. Those hours taught him something the days never did, that a soldier's fight wasn't just against an enemy, it was against time, against weariness, against his own mind. And those lonely watches made the memory of home sharper. It was during those silent hours, with the world holding its breath, that thoughts of family crept in, faces, voices, smells that seemed almost close enough to touch. And that was the worst and best part. Because when the mind finally turned toward home, it didn't want to stop. And the next watch would feel even heavier for it. Which was why the following days, when letters were scarce and news was thin, that pull toward home became a quiet, constant ache. It filled the spaces between orders. It whispered in the dark. And soon, it would demand to be heard. It's strange how the mind stores things. You could forget where you put a tin of bullets or when you last ate, but the smallest piece of home stayed sharp. Out there, in the dark with nothing but a rifle and the hum of insects, memory became its own kind of noise. Faces came uninvited. Voices slipped through like radio static. And they never came all at once, just fragments, like torn paper scattered across a table you could never quite clear. Sometimes it was as simple as a smell. Smoke would catch in his nose, and suddenly he was back near a hearth, knees tucked under him, listening to his mother hum while rice steamed. A sudden sound of water slapping against a rock, and he'd see his father's hands hauling a net from the river, the sun flashing on silver scales. These were things he hadn't thought about for years, but here, where the world was stripped to mud and orders, they came back bright and sharp. The letters helped when they came. Thin paper, corners soft, words written in careful strokes. Sometimes entire lines were missing, ink blacked out by someone far away. Even so, a single sentence could fill a whole night. We are well. Your sister started school. The fields are green. He'd read it again and again until the paper felt worn enough to vanish. Then he'd fold it carefully, tuck it close to his chest, as if it could keep him warm. But more often than not, there were no letters. Just men leaning against each other, sharing news like rumors. A cousin heard Tokyo was burning. A neighbor moved to the hills. Someone's father died. Someone's wife remarried. The words traveled without proof, but they still landed like stones in the gut. You learned not to ask too many questions. Home became both a comfort and a wound. Thinking about it could keep you steady when things turned bad. It could also break you. Some men avoided it altogether. They hardened themselves, pretended they had no past. Others clung to it so tightly you could see it in their faces at night, their eyes gone far away even as their hands cleaned rifles. He was somewhere in between. He didn't talk much about family, but they were there, all the time, like an echo. His mother's voice, his brother's laugh, the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder. It wasn't longing exactly, it was more like carrying a picture you couldn't put down. Some days it kept him walking, some days it slowed him. There were other memories too, the kind you didn't share. Mistakes. Arguments. Things you wished you'd said before leaving. The night had a way of magnifying those regrets. In the barracks or on watch, with the stars staring down, you sometimes saw them clearer than the path ahead. And then there were the imagined futures. What would happen if he made it back? Would the house still stand? Would the fields still smell the same? Would anyone recognize him? He thought of his brother's face grown older, his mother's hair silvered, his father quieter now. These were guesses, but they hurt because they were guesses. The worst was the fear that home was moving on without him. That life, in all its ordinary beauty, was carrying on while he was stuck here with mud on his boots and ghosts in the trees. That maybe they'd forget, or worse, remember him as a name on a tablet instead of a man who once laughed. These thoughts didn't stay politely tucked away. They crept in when you were least ready, while eating, while cleaning your rifle, while waiting for dawn. They slipped into your boots, your pack, your dreams. And they made the quiet moments louder, because memory was the one thing the war couldn't order you to silence. And yet, despite the ache, these fragments were fuel. They were reminders of something worth carrying. And when news came, good or bad, you folded it into your pack like it weighed nothing, but it weighed everything. Which is why the next moments mattered so much. Because when you had a scrap of paper in your pocket and a thought of home in your chest, choosing what to keep and what to let burn became something far larger than following orders. It became a decision about what mattered most when everything else was falling apart. When you're carrying your whole life on your back, paper suddenly feels heavier than steel. It's strange, but it's true. Letters, scraps of newsprint, even little sketches, they all seemed light enough when you first folded them. But weeks later, with your pack rubbing sores on your shoulders and the air thick enough to drink, that little weight started to feel like a stone. And yet, the harder it got, the more you wanted to keep it. It wasn't just about words on a page. It was about proof that someone far away still thought of you, still waited, still cared enough to take a pen to paper. A letter was a line back to a world that didn't smell like mildew and cordite, a world where food didn't come in handfuls and where night didn't mean counting shadows. But war is practical, even when men aren't. There were times when orders came down to strip weight. Burn anything you can't eat, can't shoot, can't wear. It was meant to keep them fast, keep them light, ready to move. And that meant paper went into the fire. He remembered the first time he fed a letter to the flames. His hands didn't want to do it. The paper was thin, worn at the creases, a little smudge where his mother's hand must have hesitated. It wasn't much, but it was hers. He held it a long time, the edge catching a little sweat, before finally pressing it into the embers. The fire ate it quick, curling the edges, turning the words to ash before he could change his mind. The others didn't look at him. They were busy doing the same. You didn't watch a man burn his memories. And yet, not everything went to the fire. There was always one, the one you couldn't give up. Maybe it was a last letter from a father now gone, or a brother's rough joke, or a promise you couldn't let die. His was a short note, barely a dozen words, written by a sister with a laugh so loud it used to fill their small house. "Come home, idiot. You still owe me a game of Go." It was silly, and that's why he kept it. Folded small, tucked into an inside pocket where sweat couldn't reach, carried like a second heartbeat. Some nights, when the jungle pressed in too tight or the silence turned mean, he'd take it out, thumb brushing over the ink until the letters blurred. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The choice, what to burn, what to keep, felt like deciding which parts of yourself to save. And in those fires, Little pieces of men vanished every day. Maybe that's why they started telling each other more stories after. When the paper was gone, you still needed to speak the names, remember the smells, laugh at the same old jokes. Those fires left the camp smelling of ash, but they also left it lighter. Packs closed, boots lifted, rifles swung. The war pulled them forward again. But the small weight in his pocket was always there, a quiet reminder that not everything could be reduced to ash. And that mattered most when movement turned to chaos, when the paths blurred and the orders came faster than the ground could hold, when men started running not toward something, but away. Because the next memory wouldn't be of sitting still and writing, it would be of losing your breath, your bearings, and almost everything else. It's easy to think of war as lines on a map, neat arrows, circles, and squares showing progress or loss. But a map doesn't scream. It doesn't stumble. It doesn't carry the weight of men trying to hold order when the world is running. Retreat wasn't planned here, it was felt. It came like a storm breaking, a hum that turned into a roar. The first signs were subtle. An officer walking faster than usual, his voice a little sharper, radio chatter clipped and brief, a comrade glancing too often over his shoulder. Then came the orders, not shouted, not panicked, but urgent. Move. Sometimes no reason, sometimes a word, enemy sighted, artillery cut off. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: boots churning, packs swinging, men becoming shapes in motion. There was a rhythm to marching forward. Retreat had no rhythm. It was stop and go, clatter and crash, a dozen voices where there should have been one. Gear dropped to make speed. Someone's pack split, spilling rice onto the ground. No one stopped to gather it. A rifle jammed and was carried like dead weight. The jungle seemed to close in, turning paths into walls. Sound was everywhere. The crack of branches breaking, the harsh call of a sergeant, the heavy breathing of men pushing too hard. Behind it all, the world seemed to rumble, shells somewhere, maybe close, maybe not. That uncertainty was worse than the noise. The unseen always is. He stayed with the unit, legs burning, lungs pulling air like water through a straw. A man went down ahead of him, knee twisting under weight, and two others hauled him up without breaking stride. No one left anyone behind if they could help it, but sometimes help was a hand pulling you forward when you wanted to stop. The mind changes during retreat. It shrinks. There's no room for speeches or dreams, just the next step, the next breath, the next order. It's strange, but fear doesn't always come as panic. Sometimes it's cold, sharp, almost calm. You know what you can carry and what you can't. You keep what matters, your rifle, your small pieces of home, your friends, and the rest stays behind. Even the sounds of battle took on a different tone. A gunshot wasn't just a threat, it was a reminder that something was following. A shout could be an order or a warning or just a man trying not to be left alone. And still, there were moments of quiet humanity in the scramble. Someone stopping just long enough to tighten another's strap. A hand brushing a shoulder to say, without words, still with you. A brief glance between friends, faces streaked with mud, teeth flashing in a grim smile. When they finally slowed, lungs heaving, night already pressing in, no one said much. Packs came off, rifles checked, water swallowed in long gulps. The silence afterward was heavy, but it carried something like relief. They had moved, they had lived, and for now, the noise was behind them. But that didn't mean safety. Retreat only opened another truth. The jungle was not a friend, and the path forward could vanish underfoot. Men had to learn quickly that losing ground was only the beginning of another fight, not with the enemy, but with the world around them. Because in the days that followed, there was no front or back. There was just green, endless and shifting, the line between hunter and hunted blurring every time a branch cracked. And in that green, survival shrank to instinct, turning men into something more raw and more desperate than they ever thought they'd be. Retreat didn't end with silence. It ended with green swallowing everything, voices, footprints, even thought. Out here, the jungle wasn't just a backdrop. It was alive, watching. It seemed to lean in closer the deeper you went, branches lowering like arms, roots reaching across paths you thought you knew. And when the march slowed, When orders shrank to a whisper, the only thing louder than your own heartbeat was the weight of that endless, breathing world. The ground was never kind. Where the earth wasn't slick with mud, it was hard and uneven. Each step demanded focus. A single misstep could twist an ankle, could break more than bone. Sweat ran into eyes, stinging, and the air pressed heavy against the chest. Even breathing felt like work. Boots sank, packs pulled, rifles cut into shoulders already rubbed raw. There were no landmarks, not really. Everything looked the same: green, brown, gray, tangled in layers. Trails vanished overnight, swallowed by vines or washed away by rain. What yesterday had been a clear path was today a wall. The compass was your only friend, and sometimes even it seemed to spin. The sounds played tricks. A bird's call could make you stop cold. The crack of a branch could mean an animal or something worse. Whispers carried strangely in that wet air, bouncing and bending. Men learned to speak with hands, with glances. The jokes grew fewer, the silences stretched. He watched his comrades change too. The ones who'd been loud grew quiet. The ones who'd walked slow found new speed. Eyes sharpened. They moved more like hunters than soldiers, because here, everything hunted. Even the insects came for blood. The air was thick with them, whining at ears, biting at skin, crawling into cuffs and collars. Sleep was shallow. They took turns, backs to trees, boots still laced. Nights brought more sounds than days, frogs booming like drums, leaves rustling with unseen weight, an occasional cry sharp enough to freeze you. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it wasn't. Food became something to chase. The rice they'd carried thinned faster than they liked. A root here, a bit of meat if lucky, water always boiled when possible. Hunger sharpened men, made them restless, but no one complained. There was nothing to complain to, and the trees didn't listen. And then there was the fear. Not the fast kind, the kind that makes you run, but the slow kind, the steady gnawing that ate at you when you realized the enemy wasn't always a man. The jungle could wound too. A cut could turn dangerous. A fever could knock you off your feet. A single misjudged step could send you sliding down into something you couldn't climb out of. Yet there was a strange beauty in it too. Even in misery, the world was vivid. Flowers burned red and yellow in the green. Streams caught the light like glass. Birds flashed bright wings before disappearing. Once, he saw a butterfly settle on a rifle barrel. It stayed for only a breath, but it made something soften in his chest. These moments were rare, but they mattered. They reminded you that even here, even when everything seemed set against you, life went on. And maybe that's why it hurt more when someone didn't come back. Because in the jungle, losing a man didn't always come with noise. Sometimes it was just a shape ahead you never saw again. The jungle was merciless that way. It covered tracks quickly, swallowed evidence, left nothing but questions. You'd scan the trees, call a name softly, wait. Sometimes they returned. Sometimes they didn't. And through it all, the unit kept moving. Forward, sideways, anywhere but still. Each man carried not just his rifle and pack, but the growing realization that the world was bigger and stranger than any order could hold. The war was still there, somewhere beyond the trees, but here, the fight was closer against the mud, against thirst, against the silence that made every sound a threat. And deep down, every soldier knew the jungle didn't care about victories. It only cared that you respected it, or it would take you whole. Which made the next moments, the losses they couldn't avoid, hit harder. Because the jungle didn't pause for grief, and neither could they. The jungle didn't just take space, it took people. Sometimes with noise, sometimes without. A burst of gunfire and a shout you couldn't mistake. A sudden slip and a dull sound in the distance. Other times, it was nothing more than silence, a man at the back of the line who wasn't there when you looked again. You could shout his name, even search for a few minutes if the orders allowed, but the jungle closed around those holes fast. It was an unforgiving thief. They had been taught what to do, drilled on the rules, count, report, recover if you can. But reality was different. The truth of retreat, of hunger, of endless movement, was that sometimes you couldn't. Sometimes the ground was too rough, the fire too close, the time too short. A man might fall, and the next step would take you away from him forever. The first time it happened, it cut deeper than any wound. One of their own went down in mud thick enough to trap an ox. The others tried hand straining, boots slipping, but the order came sharp and hard: leave him. It felt wrong, like a betrayal written in the loudest silence. They went anyway, eyes burning, feet heavy. No one spoke for a long while. It happened again and again. Sometimes with a bullet, sometimes with fever, sometimes with nothing anyone could explain. Men were flesh and bone, and the jungle didn't care about either. Even if you found them later, sometimes all you found was a rifle, a pack, a helmet turned upside down like an empty bowl. They learned to carry the weight of absence. Each man gone was a thread cut, and the line kept thinning. Faces blurred, but you remembered voices, laughs, the way someone smoked or told a story. That's what you held on to. The hardest part wasn't the moment of loss, it was the moving on. The body taught you how to walk away. The mind argued, but the boots kept going. You told yourself they might have made it out, might be somewhere safe. But deep down you knew. And that knowing sat in your chest, heavy and quiet. Some soldiers made small marks, their own private rituals. A carved initial in a tree. A stone piled where someone fell. A muttered prayer in a language soft enough to be mistaken for the wind. It was all they could give, because nothing else fit in their hands. And yet, even in that cruel rhythm, there were rare chances. Once, a man collapsed from fever. They couldn't carry him, not with the enemy close, but a comrade stayed behind anyway. Just one kneeling, water pressed to dry lips, rifle across his knees. The rest moved on, but later, somehow, the two rejoined the unit, ragged and thinner, but alive. That night, no one complained about the risk. These moments stitched something fragile and powerful into the group. They understood now that every face could vanish. And that made the bonds tighter, the jokes softer, the silences deeper. Even a shared glance could hold something close to reverence. It's strange, but loss doesn't always hollow. Sometimes it sharpens. It made them listen more carefully, step more lightly, check more often that the man ahead was still there. Every shape counted. Every breath behind you mattered. And when they moved on again, rifles ready, boots sinking, they carried ghosts. Not the kind that scare, but the kind that stand quietly at the edge of thought, reminding you why you keep going. The line was thinner now. And each man knew that somewhere ahead, there would be more silence, more space where someone used to be. They just hoped, when it was their turn, someone might glance back, even once. When a soldier disappeared, the space he left behind was like a shadow. But sometimes that shadow was filled by something else, a piece of the world that didn't belong to you. In the jungle, you could go days without seeing an enemy face and then, without warning, stumble onto their trail. A crushed fern. A cigarette but burned down to ash. And every now and then, something stranger, boots. It happened without ceremony. They were moving slow that day, the heat thick, their shirts clinging, their nerves worn thin from the losses. A man at the front stopped suddenly, raised his hand. Everyone froze, rifles lifting as if pulled by strings. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. And then they saw it, half hidden under leaves, a pair of worn boots, toes pointing toward them, the leather cracked and caked with mud. There was no body. Just the boots, laces frayed, one heel worn flat. The sight did something to the line, it tightened it, like a fist closing. The enemy had been here. Not far. Maybe an hour. Maybe a minute. You never knew. They gathered around cautiously, eyes sweeping the trees, every sound now louder. Someone turned one boot over with the muzzle of his rifle. Empty. Light. The kind of empty that made you wonder about the man who had walked in them, how far he'd gone, whether he was even alive. Some men joked softly, because joking kept the fear down. A laugh about how poorly made they were, a mutter about how light they felt compared to their own. But no one really laughed. Those boots were like a message left behind. We were here. We are still here. The enemy's belongings were rare, but they carried weight. Sometimes it was boots, sometimes a canteen, sometimes a scrap of paper with writing you couldn't read. Each item told you something. They were hungry too, thirsty too, tired too. It was unsettling to realize the man you feared might be just as worn and thin, his feet blistered, his shoulders aching. Once, they found a single cartridge case, polished by rain. Another time, a cooking fire still faintly warm, smoke only a memory. Each clue made the air heavier. You became aware of your own breathing, the closeness of your pack, the sounds your boots made. They never took the boots. That wasn't superstition exactly, it just felt wrong. They belonged to someone who might be watching, someone who might come back for them. The officer kicked a little dirt over them, a quiet gesture that said more than words, leave them. Move on. Still, the image stuck. For days, he kept seeing those boots, imagining the feet that had filled them, the path they had taken. Were they afraid too? Were they hiding now, eyes fixed on the same trees? It was easier to hate an idea than a man, but boots made it harder to pretend. The discovery tightened them, made them sharper. The jungle wasn't empty. It was shared, and not by friends. Every step after that felt louder. Every pause lasted longer. And at night, when the watch passed quietly from hand to hand, those boots were there in memory, silent, waiting. Which made the next stretch, the long quiet days that followed, feel stranger. Because for once, there were no orders to advance or retreat. There was just waiting, always waiting, and the silence that came with it. And silence, out here, was never peace. The strangest thing about those boots was what they left behind. Nothing. No shots fired, no chase through the trees, just that pair sitting there like a whisper. And in the hours and days after, the jungle seemed to grow still in a way that didn't feel right. It wasn't rest, it was tension, stretched thin like a wire. At first, you welcomed it. After the rush, the loss, the noise, silence felt like a blessing. Boots didn't drag, shoulders loosened just slightly. Men let themselves breathe, maybe even talk a little more. They cleaned rifles without urgency, shared what food they had left without the usual edge. But the longer it lasted, the heavier it got. Because silence doesn't mean safety, not here. Out here, noise was proof of life. Birds calling, insects buzzing, a comrade's cough, the clink of metal. When it all pulled back, the mind started to listen harder, and the harder you listened, the more you heard things that weren't there. Every twig snapping was a footstep. Every shadow was a shape. A gust of wind through the leaves could make your finger tighten on the trigger. Men glanced at each other more, their eyes flicking quick, waiting for a word that didn't come. It made even the smallest tasks feel bigger. Filling a canteen became a mission. Tying a bootlace felt like an opening for something to strike. They moved slower, closer, as if any gap could swallow someone whole. The veterans didn't talk, they just kept their hands on their rifles scanning. The younger ones shifted, restless, not sure if they were bored or afraid. Night was worse. The silence turned thick. Normally, the jungle hummed frogs, birds, insects, but now there were stretches of nothing, just the wind and your own pulse. On watch, every sound you made seemed too loud. Even swallowing water felt like a signal. The enemy might have been close, they might have been gone. That was the trick of it. Silence could mean they were waiting, watching, or simply nowhere near. You couldn't know. And so, you treated it like a loaded gun pointed your way, careful, deliberate, wary. There was a lesson in it too. War isn't always shouting and thunder. Sometimes it's holding your breath for hours, days, because you think something might be behind the next tree. And that fear was almost worse. It wore you down, minute by minute. Some men muttered about it, half-jokes to keep the edge dull. Even the birds deserted, one said. Another laughed about ghosts. But the laughter didn't last long. Even a chuckle seemed to echo too much. He found himself thinking more during those days. The silence gave space for thoughts you'd buried, faces of the gone, the sound of home, the weight of the pack when it was full of letters instead of bullets. Sometimes he hated it for that. Other times, it was almost kind, like the jungle itself was giving them a moment to remember before it took again. But no silence lasts forever. It only hides the next noise. And sure enough, when it broke, it wasn't with birdsong. It was with a crackle of static, the low voice of a radio that hadn't spoken for days. And every man in earshot leaned closer. Because after silence, even a word is loud. And this word carried something heavier than the pack on his back, Rumors of surrender. It started with a sound almost too small to notice, a crackle, faint, like dry leaves breaking under a boot. A soldier stopped cleaning his rifle. Another leaned in closer to the battered radio propped against a crate. The voice came and went, caught in static, nothing clear at first. But in a place where silence had stretched so long it made your thoughts loud, even static felt like a shout. Then came the fragments. A name. A place. Words so broken they barely made sense. And one word that made every man glance at the other, some shaking their heads, some staring blankly: surrender. They didn't believe it at first. How could they? Surrender belonged to other people, other places. Not here. Not to them. They were the ones still moving, still carrying rifles, still watching the tree lean. But the rumor was a seed, and once planted, it grew fast. The static gave way to another crackle, another voice, different, but carrying the same shape of the word. The reactions were as varied as the men themselves. Some laughed, short and bitter, saying it was nonsense. Others leaned closer, trying to catch anything more, eyes sharp, mouths tight. One man cursed under his breath, shaking his head like he could shake away the sound. Another crossed his arms and said nothing at all. The thing about rumors is they don't need clarity, they just need air. And in those tense hours, the air was thick with it. Maybe it was only a ceasefire somewhere far away. Maybe someone misheard. Maybe it was propaganda. But maybe, just maybe, the war was ending, and that thought, terrifying and hopeful, twisted in the chest in a way no bullet ever could. They tried to work as usual. Packs were adjusted, watch schedules kept, meals eaten as best they could. But the rhythm was off. Men moved slower or faster, distracted. The silence they'd feared earlier was replaced by quiet conversations that stopped when an officer came close. They talked not of tactics, but of home, what they'd do, who they'd see, what they'd eat first. Yet the doubt lingered. What if it was true? What if it wasn't? Which was worse, to believe and be wrong, or to ignore it and miss the moment? For the officers, it was worse. They had nothing solid to give, nothing confirmed. A nod here, a shake of the head there. Some were stern, telling the men to focus, to stay sharp. Others were softer, quieter, but they looked older suddenly, the weight of decision pressing on their shoulders. And under it all was something no one said out loud. If the war was ending, did that mean all this, the mud, the hunger, the fear, was over? Or did it mean everything they'd carried was about to be measured and judged, every loss counted? The night didn't help. Darkness turned the rumor into a living thing, a shadow moving from man to man. Someone swore he'd heard confirmation. Another said it was false, just a tactic. Dreams that night were strange. Some men smiled in their sleep, others thrashed. By dawn, the radio was quiet again, but the word had sunk in. Surrender. It tasted foreign, bitter, but it wouldn't leave. And then, as they moved out again, rifles still slung, boots still heavy, the static came back. Stronger this time. A voice clearer. Not a rumor now, but a report. And when the officer's face tightened, every man knew something had changed. That's when the ears leaned closer, not just to the radio but to the ground itself. Because words are one thing. Proof is another. And if something truly was ending, the first sign might not come from a voice at all. It might come from the sound of metal being put down or sharpened. When the word surrender first slipped into their world, it was a ghost, thin, uncertain, more wish than fact. But once a ghost is named, you can't unhear it. The radio became the heart of the camp, the only thing that mattered. Men who hadn't cared for static before now leaned in at every hiss, heads close enough to touch, breaths held like prayers. The set itself was nothing special, a scratched metal box, knobs worn smooth, the antenna bent like an old finger. But it might as well have been a sacred relic. It carried voices that came from somewhere beyond the trees, from a world they couldn't see anymore, a world that might still have cities, kitchens, families. The voices weren't even whole. They broke, stuttered, came half in code. But each burst was swallowed like water. They listened differently now. No one cleaned a rifle when the radio spoke. No one stirred rice or joked. They froze, hands still, eyes narrow, leaning toward the crackle like men trying to catch a language they almost understood. A name here, a date there. Sometimes a phrase, sometimes nothing. And always, the officers too close for comfort, leaning in, nodding, shaking their heads, faces unreadable. A slight frown could turn a room silent. A raised eyebrow could start a whisper spreading. The chain of command didn't need words when a single look could confirm or deny hope. Sometimes, the radio brought nothing but routine, weather reports, garbled numbers, static. Sometimes it carried news from other places, other fights. And sometimes, just for a second, it felt like it carried the weight of the whole war. Mentions of treaties, movements, words like capitulation and unconditional. The hardest part was the waiting. The radio never gave a full sentence, never something clean enough to believe. They filled in the blanks themselves. A pause became a promise. A loud burst became fear. Men carried their own translations back to their bunks. It's over. It's a lie. We move tomorrow. And yet, through all of it, the work continued. Watches kept, boots laced, rifles oiled. The war didn't end just because a word came through a wire. But there was a shift, subtle but real. They were listening more than fighting now. Even when they dug trenches or patrolled the perimeter, ears tilted toward where the radio sat. At night, when it was quiet and the lamps burned low, some men crept closer, asking nothing but standing near. The radio was like a fire they could warm their thoughts by. A single crack of sound and heads lifted, eyes bright, hearts beating faster. And then there were the arguments. If the news was true, why were they still here? Why keep holding? Why keep watching the trees? Some said it was a trick, that the enemy was spreading lies. Others believed it without question, already imagining doors opening and trains coming home. The officers stayed firm, but not unkind. The truth was simple: until orders came, nothing changed. It made the smallest things feel huge. A courier's arrival. A hand signal from an officer. A glance toward the set. Men would drop their spoons mid-meal just to hear a burst of static. And when a clear phrase came through, even if it meant nothing to them, you could feel the entire camp lean forward. It was strange, thinking that something so small, something powered by weak batteries and wire, could hold so much weight. But it did. And in the end, every man there knew one thing: whatever happened next, the sound of that radio would mark it. Which is why, when the rations thinned even more, when ammo was counted and recounted, no one panicked. They only listened harder. Because rumors of peace were just that, rumors, and until they heard something final, they prepared for the only thing they truly understood: survival. And survival meant holding on to everything you had, even when everything was running out. The voices on the radio never promised anything certain, and while the static carried words like surrender and capitulation, the ground beneath their boots stayed the same: mud, vines, stones, uncertainty. Hope doesn't fill canteens or chambers. So they kept counting. They counted water, they counted rice, they counted bullets. And every count came up shorter than the last. The rifles stayed slung across shoulders, but the weight inside them was lighter, and everyone knew it. A magazine that once seemed heavy now rattled like a box of matches. Shots were saved, not spent. Every burst of gunfire was measured, deliberate, a sound that carried risk as much as power. It made the men quieter. They weren't defeated, but they were cautious in a way that gnawed at the nerves. A soldier without enough ammunition still looks like a soldier, but he walks differently. The rifle was still there, cold metal, steady wood, but the mind knew what the chamber held and didn't hold. It made every shadow heavier. That's when the knives came back into their hands, tools turned weapons, reminders of an older kind of fight. Bayonets were cleaned with more care. Blades were sharpened on stones until they gleamed faintly in the half-light. Even small utility knives, meant for cutting rope or opening rations, were handled with new attention. Men slipped them into belts, boots, packs, like old friends returning. It wasn't bravado, it was habit. A soldier's mind adjusts fast. If the rifle is uncertain, the hand goes to what's sure. Steel doesn't jam. A blade doesn't need a signal. And in close quarters, in the deep green where you might see nothing until a breath touched your face, a sharp knife meant the difference between going forward or not going at all. The officers didn't say much about it. They knew. They carried blades too. There were no lectures about conserving ammo anymore. That was already understood. Instead, the talks were about staying close, about watching each other's backs, about using the terrain if the time came. The jungle made knives practical anyway. A blade cleared vines, opened cans, cut cloth for wounds. It was always in the hand, always familiar. But now every man felt the edge differently. It was one thing to cut rope. It was another to think about cutting flesh. No one said it, but it hung there. There was a strange comfort in it too. The knife was simple, honest. It didn't lie about what it could do. Holding it, you felt connected to something older than radios and rifles, a kind of survival that belonged to any man, anywhere. It steadied you, reminded you that even stripped down, even without the noise of machines, you still had a fight left. But there was an unease that came with it, an unspoken understanding. If it came to blades, it meant something had gone wrong. It meant the world had closed in too tight. And so each man hoped he'd never need the steel for more than vines or bark. Still, when night fell, when the watch passed from hand to hand and the radio went quiet, there was a subtle ritual. Rifles laid close, yes, but knives even closer, the familiar weight of them under blankets, near boots, in reach. It made home feel farther away somehow. Rifles were for armies, knives were personal. They made the war smaller, closer, like a whisper instead of a shout. And with the rumors still hanging in the air, that whisper felt louder than ever. And then came the sight that cut through all of it, a piece of cloth seen through the trees, moving slow, pale against the green. Not a sound, not a shot, just color where there shouldn't be. A flag, maybe. A signal. Something that said this chapter was about to change. The jungle was still the same, wet leaves, tangled roots, mud-swallowing boots, but the men inside it were different now. Rifles felt lighter, magazines rattled nearly hollow, and knives glinted more often than they should. They had learned to move quietly, to speak less, to keep their eyes open and their chests tight. But nothing prepared them for the sight that came one morning, pale against all that green. It wasn't much, just a strip of color at first, a blur between branches. Someone at the front stopped so abruptly the line rippled back. No one spoke. No one had to. A hand went up, fingers spread. Wait. The color moved slightly, swaying like a leaf, then catching the light. White. They crouched lower, rifles steady though lighter than ever, knives ready if needed. The officer stepped forward slowly, his boots finding roots like stepping stones, each footfall deliberate. The jungle had taught them that anything could be a trick. Cloth could hide a muzzle, a voice could lure you in. But as they inched closer, the shape became clearer, a flag. It wasn't flying high like victory. It hung low, tied to a branch, edges damp and torn. White cloth, nothing more, but white enough to speak. It was rough, improvised, maybe torn from a shirt. The corners frayed, a faint stain spreading like a bruise. But it was there, undeniable. They froze. A flag of surrender was something you saw in books, not here, not like this. For a long time, no one moved. The jungle itself seemed to hush as if listening. The officer motioned for two men to flank, rifles raised though they held almost nothing. The rest stayed back, crouched in the green, hearts thudding like hammers. Every sound felt louder, birds calling far off, a drop of water falling from a leaf, the faint hum of insects. Closer still. The flag moved slightly, stirred by some unseen breeze, and beneath it, they saw nothing but the branch it was tied to. No man. No sound. Just a signal left behind, silent and small, like a letter without words. Questions came but stayed in their throats. Was it meant for them? Was it from the enemy or from another group of their own? Was it real surrender, or a trap, or just a message to someone they'd never meet? The officer cut it down carefully, folding the damp cloth like it was glass. He tucked it into his pack without a word. They waited for him to speak, to tell them what it meant, but he only looked at the jungle as if trying to read it. Finally, he gave the signal, keep moving. But the air was different after that. The white had changed something. Men glanced at each other more often, their faces carrying questions they didn't ask. Surrender was no longer a rumor on a radio or a whisper in the night. It had shape now. It could be touched. It was real enough to stain your hands. And still, they moved. Rifles lighter, knives sharper, but now carrying an image tucked between their thoughts, a strip of white, fluttering in the green, saying something no bullet could say. That night, when they stopped, no one mentioned it aloud. But the flag was there in every silence, as if it was watching too. The next morning, the static came again. Stronger. A voice clearer than before. And this time, it wasn't fragments. It was a sentence. And every man leaned closer, because this time, the words would be too big to ignore. The radio's voice was different that morning. It wasn't the usual broken hum, the clipped phrases scattered like leaves in static. It was steady, too steady, like a hand on your shoulder when you're not ready to be touched. Men leaned in closer without being told. Some stopped eating. Others simply froze, eyes locked on the battered box. And then it came, clear enough to make every man glance at another. The war is over. But words travel faster than reality. Out here, where maps meant less than instinct and the jungle swallowed everything, the end of a war didn't mean the end of being hunted or hungry or afraid. They didn't cheer, no one threw hats. Instead, they stared, as if waiting for something else to follow, a correction, a detail, some sign that it mattered to them. The officer said nothing for a long time. His face was unreadable, his hand resting lightly on the radio like it might break if he moved too fast. Finally, he gave the smallest nod, not to the radio, not to the men, but to himself. The message was real. And still, nothing changed. Their rifles didn't vanish. Their packs didn't get lighter. The ground didn't smooth out. The enemy didn't suddenly appear with smiles and open hands. It was the strangest feeling to be told that what you were living for, what you were dying for, was over, and yet nothing around you believed it. For some, relief came like a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Shoulders dropped, even if just slightly. A laugh slipped out somewhere, sharp and short, almost guilty. Others tightened their grips on rifles, suspicion carving lines into their faces. Surrender didn't always mean safety. Sometimes it meant chaos. He felt both things at once. There was a pull toward home, sharp enough to make his chest ache. And there was fear, a quiet, cold one, that they wouldn't get there. The jungle still belonged to no one. Supplies were still thin. Radios could lie. The rest of the day was strange. Orders came slower, quieter. The officer kept them close, moving with more care than before. They checked everything twice, routes, watches, even each other. It wasn't mistrust. It was the simple knowledge that being last to know can be deadly. By evening, the murmurs started again, softer than before but carrying weight. What did it mean? Who had surrendered? Was the enemy moving or gone, or just as lost as they were? Some men talked about home like it was a door they could finally see. Others avoided the topic, as if naming it might make it vanish. That night, no one slept deeply. Every rustle seemed louder, every step heavier. The word peace felt like a stranger sitting too close. They were told the war had ended, but their boots were still in mud, their hands still on steel, their hearts still pounding to the rhythm of things unseen. And so they moved again the next morning, quieter than ever, alert and cautious. Because peace on paper doesn't stop a bullet, and an enemy who hasn't heard or doesn't care is still an enemy. Out here, the only truth was what you could see, and all they saw was green closing in around them. The strangest thing was this. For the first time, the fighting might have been done, but the soldier's mind refused to believe it. Habit kept the rifle in his hands. Instinct kept his ears sharp. And memory kept reminding him that nothing out here disappeared without taking something with it. Somewhere behind them, the world was celebrating. Somewhere else, cities were lighting candles, bells ringing, families crying. But here, the only sound was boots pressing into damp earth and a radio gone silent. And still, that small, impossible thread of hope was there, stretched tight but real. Maybe, just maybe, the next order wouldn't be forward. Maybe the next one would point them home. They didn't celebrate. There was no point. The war might have ended for someone somewhere, but not for the men still wearing mud instead of medals. For them, the only order that mattered was the one to move, and move they did. The last march began not with cheers, but with the quiet scrape of boots against damp earth, rifles still in hands, packs still heavy though lighter than ever. Everything about it felt different. The air was the same, the trees no less thick, but the weight on their shoulders had changed. It wasn't fear anymore, not exactly. It wasn't even duty. It was something smaller, tighter, a need to get through, to see something other than green walls. The news of surrender had cracked something open in their minds, a door, a thought of home, and now every step pulled them toward it. The officer said little. Orders were few, gestures more than words. There was no sense risking a loud voice now. If the enemy didn't know yet, or if they didn't believe it, a careless shout could be the last mistake. And so they moved like shadows, disciplined but softer. Men walked differently too. Heads tilted more often toward the sky, as if expecting to see something besides leaves. Conversations were quieter, but the words had changed. Home slipped in more often: fields, streets, kitchens, the smell of cooking, the sound of children. Even a joke about an old teacher or a game played long ago sounded like a promise. But the jungle wasn't kind just because the war was supposedly over. It still demanded attention. Roots still caught boots, leeches still found skin, fevers still watched from the water. One man stumbled hard on a slope slick with rain, and without thinking, 2 hands shot out to catch him. That was the march now, each man carrying not just his pack, but whatever his friend couldn't. The silences were heavier than the words. When they stopped to rest, men sat in small clusters, drinking sparingly, checking weapons even when they prayed they wouldn't use them again. They knew too well how quickly hope could turn. Surrender on paper didn't mean a hand wouldn't tighten on a trigger in some unseen place. And yet, even with that tension, there was something softer in the air. A laugh came easier. A half-smile could travel down a line. Even the jungle seemed less hostile, though maybe that was just their minds desperate for relief. When they found a clearing that night, it felt almost sacred. No shells, no orders, no waiting for a sound that might mean death. Just open space and a low sky where stars broke through for the first time in weeks. Someone pointed out a constellation, voice quiet but sure, and for a moment, they weren't soldiers, they were just men looking at the same sky they'd left behind. Sleep came uneven, but it came. Some dreamed of nothing, finally resting. Others dreamed of home, and woke with tears they wiped away quickly. One man whispered something before he drifted off, maybe a name, maybe a prayer. The last march wasn't fast. It wasn't glorious. It was steady. One step after another, closer to something they couldn't yet see but could almost feel. And every footfall carried more than weight. It carried the quiet certainty that the world they'd known, the one of mud and whispers and knives, was closing behind them. At dawn, the officer stood a little straighter, scanning the trees like always. Then he did something they hadn't seen him do before. He smiled. Just a little, but enough. And in that small curve of his mouth was a message louder than any radio: we're close. The men didn't cheer. They simply adjusted their packs, tightened their straps, and followed. Because they knew now that one more march, one more stretch of jungle, was all that stood between them and whatever came next. And they were ready to meet it, whatever it was, because there was nothing left to fear, not really. But there was one thing left to do, and it would come soon enough. A march isn't an ending. It's just a road. And at the end of this one, a soldier still had to learn how to be someone else. The last stretch wasn't like the ones before. It was shorter, but heavier. Not because of gear, most of that was gone now, but because of what it meant. Every step carried memory. The mud, the nights on watch, the missing faces, the weight of knives, the sound of static. All of it was behind him, but not gone. They walked into a world that seemed quieter. The trees thinned. The sky opened, pale and wide. There were roads again, broken but there. A few houses, rooflines leaning, walls marked by weather and war. They moved carefully still, rifles in hand though half empty, because habit doesn't dissolve with news. And then the orders changed. They weren't really orders at all, more like suggestions. The officer's voice softened, his gestures looser. There was no longer a front line, no objective, no hill to hold. Just a path back, wherever back meant. The first civilians they saw looked at them with faces hard to read. Some stared, some turned away, some nodded once and said nothing. A few brought water. It was strange, being seen not as a shadow in the jungle, but as a man again. Clothes hanging loose, eyes darker, boots worn thin. For him, the weight of the rifle felt wrong now. It had been part of him, an extension of his arm, but now it felt like something borrowed. When they finally reached a place where someone said it was safe, where a building stood and a flag hung without fear, the rifles were stacked. Slowly, almost reverently. One by one, men placed them down, hands lingering on the wood and steel before letting go. The sound of metal against metal was soft but final. After that, there was waiting. Always waiting. Papers, lists, names. Some were called away to other places. Some left on trucks. The unit, once a line of movement, was breaking apart into smaller lines, each heading somewhere else. Goodbyes were short, mostly nods, sometimes a handshake. There were no speeches. War teaches you to move without ceremony. When his turn came, he carried little. A pack with a few rations, the knife he couldn't give up, and a folded scrap of paper, worn and soft. It was the letter from his sister, the one thing he hadn't burned. "Come home, idiot." He'd carried it through everything. The road back was strange. Trains ran slow, sometimes not at all. The towns looked different, some flattened, some untouched. People stared at the uniform, at the thinness of him, at the dirt that seemed permanent. But no one asked. Everyone was carrying something. He saw home first as a line of hills, then as fields, then as the curve of a roof he thought he'd forgotten. The walk from the station to the door was the longest of his life. His legs were steady, but his chest wasn't. Every sound, the bark of a dog, the rustle of trees, felt sharp and close. And then he saw her. His sister, older, hair longer, face surprised for only a second before she smiled so wide it almost broke him. She didn't run, she just waited, letting him close the space himself. When he reached her, she didn't speak. She didn't have to. She grabbed his sleeve, then his hand, and held on. Inside, things were familiar but smaller. The table, the smell of food, the walls marked with tiny scratches he'd never noticed before. His father's chair sat empty. His mother's hands trembled a little when she touched his face. There was joy, yes, but also something quieter, a relief so deep it made the air feel thick. That night, when the lamps were out and the house was still, he lay on a thin mat that felt softer than anything he'd known. Sleep didn't come easy. The walls creaked like the jungle. A dog barked and his heart jumped. His fingers searched for the rifle that wasn't there. But the letter was. He unfolded it one more time, though he didn't need to read it. The words were already part of him. And he understood something then. The war had ended on paper weeks ago, maybe months, but for a soldier, it never really ends in a single moment. It ends in pieces when you can take a deep breath without listening for shells, when you can close your eyes without seeing the trees, when you can eat without thinking of the next ration. The last piece came quiet, somewhere between waking and dreaming, when his sister's laugh drifted from another room. It was the same as it had always been, bright, careless, alive. And for the first time in too long, he smiled without thinking. Because that was it. That was home. And no order, no jungle, no night watch could ever take it away again.